Good morning, and I welcome you today to the second lecture of the course on EU-Russian relations. And we are going to talk about institutions, Russian institutions that take part in the design of Russian foreign policy. Look at this slide. The slide basically summarizes institutions that we are going to talk about. Russia is a presidential republic or a super-presidential republic. That's why the president is obviously the key figure for most of the policies and for foreign policy in particular. The president is assisted by the presidential administration and the Security Council. This is the central figure that we are going to discuss. We will also talk about the government, and more specifically about the Prime Minister, about some ministers, notably about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And then we will briefly talk about the Federal Assembly and about some interest groups that participate in the formation of Russian foreign policy. If you look at the Russian constitution, there are three people who can always talk on behalf of Russia. And these are the President, the Prime Minister, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And that's important, but that's more or less universal for the majority of the states. So the President and his role in the design of Russian foreign policy. Well, the competences of the President are covered in Articles 80 and 86 of the Constitution. Competences in what concerns Russian foreign policy. According to these articles, the President defines Russian foreign policy. He also provides strategic direction of the Russian foreign policy. He is in charge of the security of Russia, and he also fulfills all the formalities like signing the documents, the official agreements once they are ratified, or receiving letters from the ambassadors as well as their letters of recall. The president in Russia is hyper-strong, so stronger than even in the presidential republic. And this was due to the evolution of Russia, to the fact that initially the president had to substitute the Politburo, the Soviet time Politburo, political committee of the Communist Party. But also it dates back to the tradition of Russia of having a very strong leader, of the Tsar. And foreign policy naturally is believed to be the business of the Tsar, and that's why it's no wonder that it forms a very large part of what Mr. President does. Some scholars talk about the feudalization of Russian foreign policy in the sense that it is designed mostly by an individual rather than shaped by institutions. And the Mediterranean correctly says that Putin acquired an unprecedented degree of the autonomy when it comes to foreign policy, because he has consistently had a very high approval rate, because foreign policy is about high politics, which doesn't have any influence on the daily life, and therefore can be decided away from the limelight of the mass media. The President has established very good control of the mass media, and he has always had the support of the business. So in that sense, the degree of the autonomy in foreign policy is unprecedented. Just a very quick slide to remind you that we've had three presidents in Russia, and out of these three, Mr. Putin had the most. Mr. Putin has been the most experienced when it comes to foreign policy, because he worked abroad, he dealt with intelligence services, he later was in charge of the Committee on External Affairs in St. Petersburg, he was in charge of the Federal Security Service, and he served as Secretary of the Security Council. So in that sense, he had a very specific but profound knowledge of external affairs, and that of course gave him a particular strong role in Russian foreign policy. Two institutions assist the president when it comes to foreign policy. One is the presidential administration, which is frequently referred to as the Kremlin, with the head of the presidential administration, Anton Vaino. And then the second one is the Security Council, which is established according to the Constitution, and its secretary is currently Nikolai Patrushev. The head of the Security Council, of course, is Mr. President, and that's the position that is linked to whoever exercises the duties of the president. Presidential administration. Presidential administration is located in the Kremlin, and that's why it's sometimes referred to as the Kremlin, but also in some former offices of the Communist Party Central Committee. And in that sense, the presidential administration is sometimes believed to be straddling the two epochs, the epoch of the sort of like Soviet collective decision-making, and the epoch of being more of the current decision-making, which is more centralized. Sometimes the presidential administration is referred to as the true Russian government, because it has duplicated positions for most ministers in the Russian government. They don't have executive positions, not like as numerous, like these executive positions are not as numerous as in Russian ministries, but they definitely have positions for the strategic direction. And so that's why the presidential administration is frequently referred to as the true Russian government. And when it comes to external affairs, we are particularly interested in the Directorate for External Policy, which assists Mr. President in all his numerous foreign engagements. And then there is also a foreign policy assistant, who is usually a career diplomat, who is in charge of most speeches of the president, of all public appearances. He's a career diplomat now, and he contains the link with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and this way he indirectly sort of like he provides contacts between the presidential administration when it comes to foreign policy and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Another institution that is responsible for assisting the president in foreign policy is the Security Council. According to the way the duties of the Security Council are defined, the Security Council determines the foundations of Russian domestic and foreign policy. It coordinates all questions with security implications. It discusses most important issues like the military reform, the national security strategy, makes emergency decisions. Yeah? And the head of the council can sometimes undertake some delicate security and diplomatic missions, and he can serve as the counterpart to, for example, officials like a national security advisor in the United States. During the presidency of Mr. Putin, the role of the Security Council increased substantially, and it is one of the centers for the coordination of foreign policy activities. The government of the Russian Federation. The law of the government should be signed every time the president appoints a new government, and this law basically defines the composition of the government, the division of responsibilities among different officials, the structure of it, and many other things. As you can see, compared to the number of presidencies that we've had quite a lot of prime ministers. Yeah? All of prime ministers of Russia are in this picture from the beginning of the 1990s until present. Yeah? Some of them have been prime ministers twice, like Vladimir Putin or Dmitry Medvedev, yeah? But the pictures are here. Yeah? So they've had various experience with foreign policy. There is no actual sort of like classical line between the president and the prime minister. But if you try to conceptualize it, we can say that the president is always in charge of high politics, yeah? Matters of war and peace, foreign affairs, defense and domestic security. And the prime minister is normally in charge of low politics. At the same time, yeah, because economic relations and globalization are so important, frequently the president becomes involved in economic energy issues, and therefore sort of like this border, yeah, is not quite clear. But the fact that the president is mostly responsible for strategic issues is reflected in the situation when some ministers are directly accountable to the president, irrespective of the fact that they are members of the government. Moving further, yeah, and of course, out of all ministers in the government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs is of supreme importance. In December 18th, 1991, President Yeltsin brought the Soviet diplomatic service under the Russian control, and then all diplomats had to reapply for their jobs and their loyalty was checked. So, and this is how the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was set up. Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs was restructured several times, and it has a very complicated structure at the moment. It has geographical departments, but it also has functional departments, like the department on consular affairs, for example, or the department on rearmament, on disarmament, sorry. So, like, all sorts of structures there. And compared to the number of prime ministers that we've had relatively few ministers of foreign affairs. Yeah? Andrei Kozyrev was the first one. Yeah? So he basically moved to the position. He became the prime minister of the Russian Federation when the Russian Federation was still a part of the Soviet Union, and then he maintained this position. He was substituted with Evgeny Primakov in 1996, and we discussed it last time when we talked about the disillusionment of Russia in cooperation with the West in mid-1990s. Then Igor Ivanov arrived to this position in 1998, stayed for about 4 years, and finally Sergei Lavrov has kept this position since 2004. He is probably the longest serving minister in the present government, and definitely he hits the record for foreign ministers of Russia, of new Russia. Yeah, I mean of Russia after the independence of 1992. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The key tasks of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs are ensuring with diplomatic means the protection of the sovereignty, security and territorial integrity of Russia, rights of Russian citizens and other interests of Russia in the international arena. It is also about the implementation of foreign policy course as it is defined by the President of Russia. And finally, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in charge of all sorts of coordination of all foreign activities in Russia. And that can be horizontal coordination among different ministries in Moscow, but it can also be vertical coordination between the federal center on the one hand and the members of the federation on the other side. The coordinating role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is sometimes challenged by the Security Council. But officially, according to the documents, according to the presidential decree of 2008, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is in charge of all sorts of coordination. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs has an agency which we shortly call Россотрудничество, but a longer title for this agency is the Federal Agency on the CIA's compatriots and international humanitarian cooperation. It was established in 2008 under the aegis of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the idea behind is to promote Russian culture, Russian science, to support various language and cultural activities, to maintain links with compatriots abroad, to advertise various international exhibitions in Russia, to foster links in scientific, in the academic world, in the scientific world, in education, and also cooperates with NGOs across the world. Yeah? And the Federal Agency on CIA's compatriots and international humanitarian cooperation has numerous centers of science and culture, which are local representatives of Russia, which promote Russian history, Russian culture, and Russian language. Now, more to the military side, of course, the Ministry of Defense is also important. An important institution for the design of Russian foreign policy. The Ministry of Defense was established in 1992 as a result of the transformation from the Soviet Union to Russia. The President is Commander-in-Chief, and he operates through the General Headquarters. And then there is the Minister of Defense, who is responsible for the day-to-day business in the ministry. Russia inherited about 70% of the Soviet army, that's quite a lot, including its nuclear resources. And then Russia has been going through a number of military reforms which were targeted at three different sort of like activities. The first one was to move from the conscription army to semi-professional army. We still have conscription, but it's much shorter, and we have a substantial part of the army on the professional basis. Then the balance between the ministry and the head of the general headquarters was changed in favor of the minister that it can be civilian. Yeah, so it basically it differs. Yeah, sometimes the person who occupies this position is civilian, sometimes he is not. But in principle, the idea is about strengthening the civilian control over the army. And then, of course, reduction in the number of people who are in the army has always been the third dimension of the military reform. The Ministry of Defense has a large say when it comes to the CIS relations, and also when it comes to the dialogue with the NATO and with the United States. It is less influential when it comes to the European Union, but mostly because the European Union is not believed to be a strong security actor which can be a partner of Russia. Security services. Yeah. Well, I mentioned two services, the Federal Security Service and the Foreign Intelligence Service. Both of them emerged in the 1990s when the KGB was reformed and split into several parts. You know? So the Federal Security Service preserved the functions of counterintelligence, and then the Foreign Intelligence Service got the function of intelligence. Now there is a belief among scholars that security services are primary channels to supply information to the president, precisely because he relies on these services as most unbiased and therefore sources of true information when it comes to the security of the country. The Ministry of Economic Development is the key competitor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when it comes to Europe and when it comes to civilian economic relations, because the lion's share of the relations between Russia and the European Union are about trade, about foreign direct investments, about the WTO, and these are competences of the Ministry of Economic Development. The Ministry of Economic Development also has trade missions abroad, and that means that it has its local sort of like embassies, well, trade embassies, and can have access to the information on the ground, and therefore it is less dependent on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in terms of the immediate dialogue with the counterparts compared to other ministries. And then lastly, the Ministry of Economic Development has always been believed to be more liberal compared to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now moving to the parliament. The Russian parliament has two different chambers. The upper chamber, which is the Council of Federation, and the lower chamber, which is the State Duma. The upper chamber represents members of the federation. The lower chambers represents people of Russia. Both chambers have committees on security and foreign policy. The State Duma, in addition, has committee on geopolitics. So there are relevant sort of like bodies that deal with external relations. However, the Parliament has a fairly limited set of competences when it comes to foreign relations. It ratifies the agreements. It works with other parliaments, including the European Parliament. It can undertake various investigations in various fields connected with external relations. It can voice, or members of the Parliament can voice some undiplomatic opinions on the issues of concern for Russia. And this is a very curious function, because officially members of the State Duma, members of the Russian Parliament, of course, cannot represent Russia internationally. But at the same time, they are not just somebody. They are sort of like officials. In a way, they are parliamentaries. And therefore, the opinion that they voice is somehow semi-official. It doesn't commit Russia, but at the same time it serves the function of exploring what will be the reaction to this or that idea. Members of the parliament, of course, counter criticism of Russian foreign policy, and the Federation Council can authorize the use of Russian troops abroad. So these are the functions of the parliament. The parliament is fairly under the control of the president at the moment, to the point that one of the speakers of the State Duma at some point argued that the parliament is not a place for the discussion. Very curious quote, given the fact that the parliament is exactly a place for discussion. But that basically tells you how centralized the decision making is in today's Russia. Now, centralization is a good topic to move to the regions. Remember that Russia is a federation, and Russia in fact oscillated between two different poles. Initially, the first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, said that the regions have to take as many competences as they can swallow. That's a direct quotation. And therefore, sort of quite a lot of competences were decentralized, including in foreign contacts, foreign links. Also trade relations, economic relations, cultural links. But then, on the other hand, by the end of the 1990s, this decentralization was perceived as a potential threat to the state of Russia. So like another move started, the move to sort of like reassemble the regions and to pull some of the sovereignties from regions to the federal center. But in the 1990s and throughout the 1990s, regions were extremely active. And three types of regions can be discerned in this regard. Regions that have a specific and very explicit national and territorial identity, like Tatarstan, for example. Border regions, like the northwest of Russia, where Russia comes into direct conflict with a foreign country, with the European Union in the case of the northwest of Russia. And of course, regions that possessed important economic, financial, and other resources. And in some cases, the message that the regions transmitted were quite strong. Like the message from the Far East about territorial concessions to China, or like the message from Kaliningrad about relations with the European Union and the potential role of Kaliningrad in these relations. Or in the case of Caspian region, of Caspian regions of Russia, the message was about how to divide the Caspian Sea. So the point is that regions sometimes were extremely influential. But when Mr. Putin arrived to the Kremlin at the turn of this century, he basically reaffirmed the authority of the federal center. He established 7 federal districts, and he divided all the regions, 89 at the time, into 7 federal districts. Here we have 8 federal districts now. He then shifted from the appointment of governors instead of direct elections by the residents of a particular region. And that, of course, reaffirmed the link between the governors and the president at the expense of the link between the governors and peoples of the region. He reformed the Federation Council in such a way that governors and representatives of the local region legislative assemblies are not members of those of the council any longer. So the Federation Council now has 2 representatives which are nominated irrespective of their position in the region. He also established the State Council so that the governors of regions have a chance to meet him fairly regularly, but this body doesn't have any power. Then taxes were also redistributed in favor of the federal center, and the regional charters and constitutions were brought in line with the federal constitution on the one hand and with each other on the other hand. So therefore, regions, in fact, lost a substantial part of their autonomy, and that actually impacted their external links in the sense that they became less willing to engage with foreign partners in all sorts of relations. Business and foreign policy. Business is, of course, not an institution, but it's a very important lobbyist and assistant to institutions, of official institutions of Russian foreign policy conduct. And then again, last time we briefly talked about economization of Russian foreign policy, precisely because Russia became a market economy, and therefore private business emerged, and the conceptual issue of how to structure the new relations between the state and the business emerged. And initially, again in the 1990s, the preference was given to the business, and to the idea that the more developed business relations are, the better it is for the state. Then the pendulum swung into an opposite direction at the turn of this century, when it was decided that the autonomy of the business can actually be a threat to the state. And therefore a whole chain of events produced itself, with the destruction of some oligarchs, with some of them fleeing the country, others being put in prison, with authorities, state authorities being deputized to the boards of various companies. But at the same time, the integration of Russia into the world economy continued with a stronger sort of loyalty of on the part of the business. And I have a very interesting quote from Bagit Alekterov, the president of Lukoil, who argued that we in the company Lukoil consider ourselves a national Russian company, and we do not accept the ideology of the division into state, private and other companies. Just to stress how loyal the company is to the state. Of course, there is a necessity of mutual assistance, and it was legitimized in two different documents of 2003. One was about cooperation between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Russian Chamber of Commerce, and the second one was about cooperation between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Russian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. So two documents that somehow structure the dialogue, and the business is supposed to reinforce the foreign policy cause in exchange for the promotion of its interests by the official Russia. This is a bit tricky, of course, given the state of today's sanctions, but we will discuss sanctions a bit later in the course of this discipline on EU-Russian relations. Key business interests: by far energy business, but then of course metal groups, chemical business, forestry, transport, tourism are also important players, important fields for EU-Russian cooperation, for external economic activities of Russia, and for shaping Russian foreign policy, of course. And lastly, I should mention NGOs, and their role in Russian foreign policy. There are, of course, different types of NGOs. Russian Orthodox Church should be classified as an NGO in this particular case, and it's very active in various fields of Russian policy, including foreign policy. Russian Orthodox Church is, of course, preoccupied with maintaining its position, but also with maintaining the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church throughout the world. There are human rights organizations that are active both internally and externally. Internally, they try to mobilize support of outsiders in a way, sort of like, and then externally they mainly support Russian-speaking population, and they try to promote Russian culture, Russian language. So these sort of these organizations, some of them also try to promote Russian vision of human rights and democracy. There are environmental NGOs, and there are public policy centers. Very few actually, but they do exist, and their influence on the official course of Russian foreign policy is a constant topic of debate. There is a sort of cooperation between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and NGOs. Again, that was like the concept was drafted at the turn of the century, And it was mostly about information and analysis, but it's also about the support of Russian-speaking minorities abroad, the compatriots abroad, development of regional cross-border cooperation, something that we know in St. Petersburg very well, but also voicing non-diplomatic opinions about issues of concern for Russia, to gauge the reaction, to see what the state is and what the potential development might be. In parallel, of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is slightly suspicious about the NGOs, particularly when it comes to foreign NGOs active in Russia. So this is a very brief presentation of the institutions that shape Russian foreign policy, that participate in the implementation of Russian foreign policy. And with this presentation, I will wrap up this meeting of us, and I will welcome you to the next meetings on EU-Russian relations.